Hello and welcome to the History of Philosophy in China by Peter Adamson and Karen Lai, brought to you with the support of the Philosophy Department at King's College London and the LMU in Munich. Online at historyofphilosophy.net. Today's episode, The Kingly Way, Confucian Political Philosophy. Imagine that a deeply wicked person rises to hold a very powerful office like the presidency of the United States. Unlikely, of course, but it could happen. Now imagine that you are one of the people in line to become one of his close advisors. Should you accept such a position? You'd probably be torn. On the one hand, you might hope to exert a beneficial or moderating influence on the ruler. On the other hand, you might be skeptical that the ruler, vicious as he is, would take your advice. Worse still, you might fear being morally compromised yourself once you are a part of this amoral administration. Now imagine that you turn for help to some of the philosophers who have thought most deeply about the purpose and challenges of being a political advisor, the Confucians. What would their advice be? Well, Mengzi seems to give a pretty clear answer. Only the benevolent man is fit to be in high position. For a cruel man to be in high position is for him to disseminate his wickedness among the people. This sounds like you should steer well clear, and indeed the Confucians often explain Kongzi's withdrawal from political life by saying that he could not find a worthy ruler to serve. An amusing passage in the Mengzi shows what he might have been trying to avoid. After a king is quizzed on his failures as a ruler, he simply turns to his attendants and changes the subject. A pessimistic attitude about the prospects for reforming bad rulers would also fit with the Confucians' political principles. After all, they put great emphasis on the moral qualities of those in government, both those who wield supreme authority and those who assist them. But in that case, why do we see Mengzi in dialogue with a ruler like the king who could not bear to see a frightened ox? This ruler was far from perfect, yet Mengzi still thought it worthwhile to call his attention to the parlous state of his subjects. Though this king is no moral exemplar, he does have the potential for true kingship, and Mengzi's job is to get him there. In general, while the Confucians do set great store by a ruler's moral excellence, they also expect great things if the ruler will simply get one thing right: choose good advisors. Sun Tzu goes so far as to say that if the ruler can hit upon the one right person, then he can gain the whole world. This trust in the good advisor could also explain a passage we've mentioned a couple of times about the sage king Shun, who simply made himself reverent and faced south. Previously, we understood this dramatic example of wu wei, or non-action, in terms of the rulers setting a good example. But we could also take the point to be that Shun has delegated the everyday affairs of the kingdom to competent men. He could adopt a policy of non-action because he had other people to do the acting for him. With trustworthy subordinates in place, a sage king can reign without ruling. Mengzi in particular has a strong tendency to aggrandize the minister and his role, to the point that he says the ideal advisor should not be summoned like a servant. Instead, the ruler should go to him to seek counsel. Probably this has something to do with the intended audience for these texts. Remember, the Confucian works as we have them were edited by and for men of the ministerial class. For the same reason, they also give rather more nuanced advice about our opening dilemma as to whether one should serve a bad ruler. The Analects names 3 ministers of an immoral king and tells us what became of them. The master of Wei left his side, the master of Zi became his slave, and Bi Gan remonstrated with him and was therefore put to death. Instead of telling us which of them acted rightly, Kongzi adds that all 3 were good men, implying that there is something to be said for each of these approaches. A similar passage in the Mengzi describes 3 officials, one who would take order when order prevailed and relinquish it when there was disorder, one who would serve under any circumstances, and one who was not too bothered about whether he served as minister or not. By contrast, Kongzi himself would choose whether or not to serve according to circumstances. Whereas the other 3 were respectively unsullied, ready to accept responsibility, and easygoing, Kongzi was the sage whose actions were timely. This illustrates something we've mentioned before, the emphasis in Confucian ethics on reacting appropriately to situations in all their fine-grained individuality. But it also acknowledges the difficulty of doing so when the question at hand is whether or not to serve an imperfect ruler. In light of this, we might wonder whether also at the level of their political theory, the Confucians have anything to say about imperfect circumstances. Modern political philosophers talk about ideal theory, by which they mean a description of the best possible arrangement for our political and social affairs. Even if such perfection remains out of reach, such a theory might still be useful by giving us something to aim at. The closer we get to the ideal state, the better we'll be doing. At first glance, the Confucians do seem to be ideal theorists. They eagerly tell us how fantastic everything is going to be once we get a ruler who follows the kingly way, Wang Dao, and appoints good men as ministers. The Analects describes the transformative effect this will have on the people. Oversee them with dignity, and the people will be respectful. Oversee them with filiality and kindness, and the people will be dutiful. Oversee them by raising up the accomplished and instructing those who are unable, and the people will be industrious. Mengzi sounds similarly idealistic when he says that a ruler who has nourished his moral sensibility, those sprouts we talked about, and as a result shows compassion in governance, will rule the empire as easy as rolling it on your palm. Even the apparently more cynical Xunzi makes an extravagant promise to any ruler who follows the correct Tao: making one's thoughts and intentions extremely cultivated, making one's practice of virtue extremely abundant, making one's knowledge and deliberations extremely enlightened. These are the means by which the Son of Heaven obtains all under heaven. Another feature of the Confucians' political philosophy that seems rather idealistic is their frequent comparison of the well-run state to the happy family. The ruler is called mother and father of the people, and the people are said to respond to benevolent rule by naturally showing obedience, much as children obey their parents. As Kongzi advises one ruler, raise up the straight and apply them to the crooked, and the people will submit to you. In another passage, he says, when a ruler loves rightness, then none among his people will dare not to obey. Notice that these passages are not phrased in terms of mere hope, or as exhortations to the reader to support good rulers. Kongzi is making a prediction, or even a promise. If the king rules with benevolence, the people will be happy and will do what he wants. Possibly the idea here is that the kingly way leads to such good results that the people will naturally show gratitude. But if we take the comparison to the family really seriously, then we'll probably resist this idea that political support is a kind of quid pro quo offered to the ruler in exchange for benevolence. Instead, just like children with regard to their parents, the subjects will have appropriate respect for the ruler and will follow his guidance willingly and gladly, rather than out of a feeling of mere obligation. So, that's the ideal case. The question is whether the Confucians have a plan B, a non-ideal theory. If not, then they would seem to be offering us only two stark alternatives. A people lucky enough to live under sage kings will flourish, both economically and spiritually. But otherwise they will endure the traumas described so vividly in the Mengzi, with the elderly left in ditches and so on. Historically speaking, that might seem a plausible interpretation. The Confucians look back to the days of Yao and Shun, or the Duke of Zhou, for a real-world example of the good scenario, and the Warring States period was giving them a daily dose of the bad one. But if we look a bit more closely, we'll see shades of gray. In the Spring and Autumn Annals and its commentaries, for example, it's not like every political figure is portrayed as a sagely hero or a despicable villain. And as we've already noted, the scenes in which Mengzi and others offer tough advice to rulers presupposes that these rulers can be redeemed. Kongzi gives advice for how to operate in less than ideal circumstances, namely to choose one's words a bit more diplomatically than Mengzi usually does. When the state possesses the way, be audaciously correct in both word and action. When the state lacks the way, be audaciously correct in action, but let one's speech be conciliatory. Among the three classical Confucian texts, though, the one that has the most to say about non-ideal theory is the Xunzi. Whereas the Mengzi places its bets on moral education of the ruler by the Confucian minister, the Xunzi focuses on the idea of institutional measures that ensure good governance, or at least stability. This makes sense given their rival views on human nature. Whereas the optimistic Mengzi thinks that political success will blossom if the sprouts of benevolence are tended carefully, the more pessimistic Xunzi thinks that human nature is bad enough that it needs to be restrained and forced into shape. We saw him saying that this is like straightening crooked wood, and it's worth having another look at the passage where he draws this analogy. It comes in a chapter that begins with the blunt statement, "People's nature is bad," and goes on to speak of the hateful and selfish feelings born within us. Fortunately, the sage kings knew what to do about this. Because people's nature is bad, they set up ritual and rightness and established proper models and measures. Among these measures is the rank or allotment, in Chinese fen, assigned to various people under the king's rule. When fen operates throughout society, everyone, not only the few who are working as government officials, understands what is required of them in their roles. For Xunzi, it is vital that everyone knows their place within a hierarchy marked by ritual practices, a hierarchy that confers unity and thus strength. He quotes the Book of Documents with approval: "Total equality is not order." The scholar of Confucian political philosophy Sung-Moon Kim has argued that this makes Xunzi a kind of constitutionalist who puts his faith in practices and institutions rather than in the moral character of individuals. This is not to say that Xunzi has lost interest in the ideal case. He still recognizes the kingly way, which combines those traditional models and measures of ritual propriety with sincere benevolence on the part of the ruler. It is the king who manages this combination who can achieve world domination. His benevolence towers over the world, and so no one in the world fails to have affection for him. His rightness towers over the world, and so no one in the world fails to honor him. His awe-inspiring authority towers over the world, and so no one in the world dares to oppose him. But the context in which Xunzi makes this remark is telling. He's contrasting the true king to the so-called hegemon, meaning a ruler who manages to be effective at establishing stability, but without showing remarkable virtue. Hegemonic rule is far more limited than true kingship. It allows for effective governance in a smaller polity like one of the warring states, not across the whole world. But the hegemon is not likely to be toppled because he's managed to establish appropriate measures and relationships of trust with his own people and with other states. Obviously, then, the hegemon is not a deeply wicked character. He needs to at least be trustworthy and disciplined, even if he lacks benevolence and rightness. While his positive features explain his political and military success, his lack of still greater virtue explains why that success remains relatively modest. So, Xunzi's account of the hegemon does show that he's thought through a second-best political order and found much to admire in it. This is in contrast to Mengzi, who also talks about hegemonic rule, but mostly in order to contrast it unfavorably to the kingly way. In a 2015 book, Lubna El-Amin argued that the concern with order, in Chinese "si," in the classical Confucian texts, especially but not only in the Xunzi, shows that their political philosophy does stand apart from their ethics. While the most idealistic passages in these works suggest that the good ruler, working in tandem with good advisors, will instill virtue in the whole population, in fact, our Confucians recognize that this is not going to happen under the material circumstances of their own societies. Even Mengzi, who is convinced that everyone has the potential for virtue, knows it would be naive to think that everyone is actually going to attain great virtue. After all, most people in his society are focused on the more urgent task of not starving to death. This is one reason he focuses so much on the attitudes of the ruler and his close advisors, the people who might be brought to virtue or something close to it. But for El-Amin, you can get pretty far without virtue, because the right rules and institutions will at least secure stability and social order. While agreeing about the importance of institutions for the Confucians, the aforementioned Sung-Moon Kim thinks that El-Amin goes a bit too far here. He worries that a Confucian political philosophy that is truly autonomous from ethics would be indistinguishable from the philosophy of the legalist school, a generalized name for those who advocated punishments as a form of rule. As we'll see in a later episode, these legalist thinkers dispensed entirely with individual moral considerations and built their whole theory around stability-inducing measures. In Kim's favor is the fact that Xunzi does not seem to prefer the true king to the hegemon simply because the kingly way gets better results. While it is true that the kingly way is longer lasting, more militarily effective, and so on, its true fruits are the happiness and flourishing of the people. Even rule over the whole world is not an end in itself, but desirable because it would be best for all who live under heaven. In fact, our Confucians acknowledge that even the ruler of a smaller state could act with a view to the welfare of all people, not just his own subjects. Both Mengzi and Xunzi justify the so-called punitive campaign, a kind of humanitarian intervention in which a good ruler goes to war to liberate another state from a cruel tyrant. Thus, Xunzi, looking back to the virtuous Duke of Zhou, says that people of other lands were eager for his armies to invade their own, because they knew he would be a more benevolent ruler than the ones they were stuck with. This is a prime example of something we discussed in the episode on Yang Tzu, namely the Confucian acknowledgement that warfare is sometimes justified, even necessary. Here, violence is not a departure from benevolence, but an exercise of benevolence. A good ruler should always be reluctant to wage war. Mengzi is disdainful of those who do so just to increase their power, and Xunzi speaks disapprovingly of those who engage in brawling. But warfare is sometimes required by the kingly way. As Xunzi puts it, I have heard that in the way of the ancients, the fundamental task for all use of military forces and offensive warfare lies with unifying the people. What about the prospects for removing a wicked or cruel ruler, not through external intervention, but through internal revolt? It would be pretty daring to speak out too enthusiastically about this while living in a monarchical state, of course, yet our authors do consider the question. Some readers have even seen hints towards a democratic tendency in the Confucians on the basis of passages that make the support of the people a litmus test for successful rule. We already saw Kongzi saying that good rule will make the people respectful, dutiful, and industrious. Similarly, he remarks, when the way prevails in the world, commoners do not debate matters of government. The implication would seem to be that when the way is not prevailing, the commoners may get ready to rise up and overthrow their masters. We can find similar passages in the other works. Xunzi states bluntly, if the world is not unified and if the feudal lords make rebellion their custom, then the one occupying the position of heavenly king is not the right person. He also gives us the memorable comparison of the common people to the waters that can either support or capsize the ruler, who's likened to a ship. Among the early Confucians, Mengzi is most emphatic about holding officials and rulers to account. He says that if all the people of the state demand that an official be put to death, then he should be investigated and, depending on the results of that investigation, executed. Mengzi himself was upfront and critical when he spoke with kings, as we've seen. So the Confucians tread a fine line between upholding the ruler's power and holding him accountable for his actions. If there is some suggestion of democracy in early Confucian philosophy, it would be due to the legitimization of the ruler's authority based on the people of the state. In a much-discussed passage, Mengzi even endorses the killing of a king. The anecdote tells us that there were two occasions when officials got rid of the reigning kings. One was banished and the other attacked. Mengzi confirms that these events did indeed take place and goes on to pronounce an even more severe verdict. These two kings, Jie and Zhou, were tyrants. In the strongest possible terms, Mengzi calls them thieves of benevolence and rightness. They are no more than robbers and oppressors. Being so, they are mere mortals like us, and therefore, while Zhou was killed, that is not to be considered regicide. In this adept twist, Mengzi opens up the possibility of getting rid of a tyrant, but he craftily turns the tables in such a way that, as Jie and Zhou have lost the mandate of heaven, killing them does not constitute regicide. Of course, this looks like something of a technicality. The ruler has been killed, even if we don't call it regicide. But there may be a more significant limitation in Mengzi's mind. It is one thing to say that a ruler can legitimately be deposed, another to say that the people can do it in a kind of bottom-up revolution. Xunzi's comparison of the people to water that can capsize a boat is explicitly framed as a warning to a political lord, not as a justification for revolution. And when Mengzi talks about this, he suggests that only the high-ranking officers, or ministers, are allowed to act against even the worst of rulers. While they may take their cue from the unhappiness of the people, that unhappiness is only a kind of sign that things are not going well. Justin Tiwald, arguing for this merely diagnostic function of popular discontent, has given a couple of illuminating analogies. When the ministers see that the commoners are unhappy, this is like a parent who is anxious that their child doesn't like their school teacher, or like a politician's campaign staff being worried about bad opinion polls. With the difference that the parent or pollster is unlikely to phrase their concern by saying that the mandate of heaven has been withdrawn. Whereas this is exactly how the Confucians do talk about it. For all their genuine interest in realpolitik and effective governance, the Confucians' political theory also has what we might cautiously call a religious dimension. The Son of Heaven, who rules wisely over the whole world, carries that title for a reason. So, to fully understand classical Confucian political philosophy, we need to talk about this concept of heaven's mandate and whether it implies fatalism or even something like divine intervention. Heaven can wait, but only until the next installment of The History of Philosophy in China.